I was born in Manchester on the 29th of November 1921 in the most unusual place you can think of, which was a house which was behind the prison wall, Strangeways prison. The front of the house was actually part of the wall, and the back windows which faced into the prison were barred because there was access for the prisoners through the windows unless they were barred. And we came there because my father had left the army after the First World War, joined the prison service and was sent to Princetown. I took my mother down there and my brother, who was 7, and lived there for 12 months. My mother became pregnant, and then my father was transferred to Manchester because there'd been a tragedy there. They had to have a replacement engineer immediately, so she found a house temporarily where I was actually born, but within a fortnight my father asked if there was any possible place where they could go, because the house that they'd rented was absolutely useless. And they said, well, the only empty house was the matron's house. And they moved up there and lived there 8 years perfectly happily. My father was the sort of man you'd describe as strong, silent He-Man. That was what they said in the old days, that he never gave much indication of emotion. Whether that was my grandmother, his mother was like that, whether it was inherited from her, or whether it was the experiences he had in the First World War. He was in for the whole of the First World War, and that was a terrible experience for anybody. He was in the engineers, the Royal Engineers, which meant he was always up in the front line building bridges and things. He was a good workman. He was a builder by trade before he went into the army in the First World War. And he moved up through the prison service, up to eventually ended up as clerk of the works. I was very fond of my dad. I was the only girl for 7 years. Then my sister Joyce was born. So there was only my brother, who was 7 years older than me, and I was made quite a lot of. I was the only girl granddaughter at that time too, so I was more or less a little princess when I look back on it. My mother always made my clothes handmade, and my dresses were in shantung silk, always, or velvet. My mother, she was a lady's maid before her sister died in childbirth, and her mother was unable to look after the baby. She was only 2.5 pounds weight. So my mother came home and looked after the baby and had a part-time job to give herself some money in a florist's, and learnt the florist trade. And she met my father while she was in Exeter looking after my cousin, and they eventually married. As the First World War broke out, and my father was only 21, and he saw all his friends joining up in the mad rush to be patriotic, and he joined up as well. Left my mother with a newborn, well, practically a newborn baby, only about a couple of months old, and she had to go home and live with her parents because the army allotment was not enough to live on. And my grandmother looked after, by that time, the premature baby that she'd had to look after was already toddling around, so she took on my brother as well. And my mother went to work in the post office, which was unusual in those days because women had never done such a thing. And she worked in the post office right up till the end of the First World War. And that's when they went to Princetown, when my father joined the prison service. My mother was full of life, always singing or humming, and she loved life, she loved everything. Where my father, as I say, was very dour, was what the description people do say, very dour, I can't really ever remember him having a real guffaw of laughing, or he'd smile and that, but he wouldn't break out in a very self-contained man. I had a brother 7 years older than me and two sisters. The next sister was 7 years younger than me, and my youngest sister was 14, nearly 15 years younger than me. And that was how I came to leave school at 14, and my father had registered me into Pitman's Commercial College to do a 2-year course on shorthand typewriting, accountancy, everything to do with an office, prior to getting a job. And I was to start on the term after Easter. And just before I was due to go, he was transferred again to Parkhurst on the Isle of Wight. At the same time, my mother found out she was pregnant with a late pregnancy. And because of her state of health and that, my father said I'd have to stay home for as long as I was needed. So of course I was at home for the birth of my youngest sister. That was a very bad labour, and my mother was in no fit state after that to take on looking after the baby. And there was my brother and my father and my other sister as well. So I had to take on looking after the whole lot. And that lasted until I was 16, when my father moved again and moved to Dartmoor. So we went to Dartmoor. I was 16 and, well, nearly 17, just a few weeks before I was 17. My brother went to work in Exeter and lived with my cousin Ethel, because he couldn't travel up and down, that was impossible. And I was stuck in Princetown. Dad started making arrangements with his brother in Exeter to see if there was work where he worked in a chemical firm. My brother was very good to me all the time that I was home looking after the home when Anne was born. He taught me ballroom dancing, he took me everywhere, he bought me my first dance dress and dance shoes and that. And he of course was caught up in the war. He joined the Navy, which he'd always wanted to join, but my mother stopped him doing it because for some mad reason, she believed he would be lost at sea. Somebody told her he would be lost at sea, some fortune teller years before. But he went straight away and joined the Navy, and he did actually do what the fortune teller told her. He did die at sea, but he didn't drown. His ship was sunk coming back from Simonstown to the North Africa landings, and it was a depot ship, which was a ship that was fitted out to repair destroyers. And it had 600 crew on and a lot of machinery. And the U-boat pack, it was a U-boat pack of 4 or 5 submarines, thought it was a troop ship because it was so big. And they sunk it, and 24 hours behind their ship there was a troop ship coming up, which is what they thought it was, with several thousand men on. But one of the men that was on the raft that we traced after, my dad and I went into Plymouth and we traced them, and he said that he was semi-conscious when they pulled him up on the raft, and he died not long after. We think he was probably with the blast injured internally. He left a wife that he'd only actually lived with for 3 weeks with leave. That was the length of their married life, 3 weeks, but she was pregnant and he was lost he was lost on November the 11th, was when he died, and Margaret was born the following January the 5th or 6th.